What are some psychology experiments with interesting results? Story 1. Solomon Asch's experiment on conformity. He set up a test wherein he would show 3 lines of different lengths to 5 or 6 individuals, I forgot the exact number, who had to state which line was the longest of the 3. The thing is, only the last individual is the participant, and the others are actors paid to answer in a specific manner. For the first few questions, they choose the correct answer, but later on they start choosing the wrong one. The participants are conflicted as to whether they will say the correct answer or conform to the wrong answer, as to not be judged by others or due to self-doubt of their own answers. In the end, most conform. It's really interesting since it shows how powerful conformity is in the face of doubt, up to a point that some even question their own sanity during the test. Another variation of the experiment also had interesting results. It had the same setup with 5 individuals, with the last person being the participant. However, this time some of the actors say the wrong answer, while one actor says the correct one. There was an increase in participants who would choose the correct answer and avoid conformity. It shows how much doubt one can have on oneself when alone, but be brought back to self-confidence when they find outside support. Story 2. I'm late, but nobody has said it yet. The self-fulfilling prophecy studies are very important to social psychology, and their findings have many real-world applications. Basically, they brought together a group of kids and formed a class with a real teacher. They gave the kids a test for overall academics at the start of the year, but didn't really use the scores. Instead, they told the teachers that a few students, picked at random, were very brilliant and scored very highly. Then they observed the class for a long period of time and noticed that the teachers gave the kids they thought were brilliant much more attention. At the end of the study, the kids took the test again, and they found that the kids who were randomly named brilliant at the start actually scored higher than the rest of the class. The kids, again at the start, didn't score any different from the rest of the class, but through the self-fulfilling prophecy, they became the best in their class. This obviously has tons of applications in the real world, and especially education. I'd be interested to know if there are further studies on this, because it actually seems like there's a flaw in the data here. It's only really a self-fulfilling prophecy if you tell the students they're brilliant. By telling the teachers, it seems all they really did was encourage favoritism. It's no big secret that students often fare better when they get more attention. This has been part of the argument for smaller class sizes for quite some time, and it's why college students who take advantage of their professors' office hours will often outperform those who don't. I'd be really interested to know what the results look like if you say nothing to the teachers and only offer your encouragement to the students. If anyone knows of a study like that, feel free to share about it in the comments. Story 3. Research on learned helplessness is fascinating. Researchers would put dogs into shelter boxes, long cage-like structures that the dog could not move around in, and would shock the dog through the floor on one side of the box. The dog at first could easily escape the shock by moving to the other side of the box. Eventually, the researcher adds a wall so the dog can't escape the shocks. It just sits there, being shocked without escape. Through this, the dog learns helplessness over repeated trials and extended periods of time. Even when the wall is taken down, the dog won't walk to the other side and avoid the shocks anymore. It has become so used to the pain that it doesn't even try to escape when escape would be easy. This research has been used to explain certain aspects of human behavior, especially related to repeated experiences of abuse, addiction, and poverty. It takes a long time to get somebody out of this mindset, and is possibly one of the reasons why people get stuck in terrible situations. Studies like this make me think that psychologists are just mad scientists in disguise, and a pretty flimsy disguise at that. You don't need to electrocute animals to show that it's possible to become broken after a prolonged period of inescapable abuse. Sheer observation should be enough to show that. If they had literally just interviewed poor people, addicts, or victims, they would have heard first-hand accounts of the exact mindset they were supposedly proving. I really hope this wasn't a government-funded study. Story 4. The influence of the color red in sports. Judges were shown a video of a taekwondo match and awarded more points to the red competitor versus the blue competitor. When the colors were digitally reversed, judges awarded more points to the other, now red competitor. Since there's a lot more interest than I expected, here's some more info. Red may be a sign of dominance, as reddened skin is associated with higher testosterone, or possibly higher fatality in women. Wearing red may induce intrinsic psychological effects, which include dominance, in addition to altering the perception of others. Researchers found that putting red leg bands on birds increased dominant behavior, as they took the lion's share of the food. For my psychology degree dissertation, I presented photos of men to be rated on a scale of friendly, 0, to threatening, 10. Men received a higher threat score if I photoshopped their t-shirt to be red. Story 5. Split brain studies. One example, by providing differing information to each hemisphere of the brain and split brain individuals, those with a severed corpus callosum, meaning there's no communication between the two hemispheres, they found that people would actually physically grab their own hand with their other hand if they saw it making a mistake. Basically, each side of the brain controls one side of your body, and in split brain people, you can actually make both sides display a disagreement with the other, which is insane if you think about it. There's another similar experiment where people with split brains have one eye able to see a picture and the other eye can't see it. Then they draw the picture with one hand. While they're drawing the picture, if you ask them, they have no idea what the image they're being shown is. It's like they can't see it, even though they can draw it. Story 6. One time I participated in a paid research experiment. I was basically tricked into thinking I was drunk. I was placed in a room with 2 other people, and we were instructed to drink vodka with cranberry juice over a period of time while we socialized. After we drank, I was placed in a room where I had to read some flashing words on a computer. I felt pretty drunk at this point. When the researcher came back into the room, he gave me my car keys and said I was never actually given alcohol. He briefly told me that because I was anticipating drinking for this experiment, that my brain had tricked me into feeling the effects of being intoxicated. I immediately snapped out of it and was completely amazed at how I felt. See, this feels like the foundation for a way better self-fulfilling prophecy experiment than the first one. Basically, do everything exactly the same, except give the participant alcohol this time. Then tell them you hadn't given them any, and hand their keys back. Follow them home and see if they drive like someone who's not intoxicated at all. I know someone in the comments will lecture me on how dangerous that is, and to you, I say, we're already learning here that psychologists have no problem messing with any aspect of a person's life, from education to safety, in the name of science. So I feel like I could absolutely get this idea funded. Story 7. There have been some experiments conducted, but the negativity effect / negativity bias is really sad to me. It basically says that negative things have a greater emotional and psychological toll on our health than positive / neutral things. So you got an A on a test, that's great, but you totally fail a test and the world crumbles, and it's a total disaster. 100 things can go right and work perfectly throughout the day, but it goes totally undetected in our minds. Then someone cuts us off in traffic, and we fume and rage. I learned about this theory almost 3 years ago and think about it all the time. Reminds me to appreciate and notice the many little things in my day that do go right. Story 8. If you train a rat to press a lever for cocaine and then put it in a box with only that lever, it will press that lever as much as you'll allow it. The rat will stop eating and drinking and just do cocaine. If you train a rat to press a lever for cocaine and then put it in an enriched environment, e.g. other rats to play with, toys, places to explore, where it can still press the lever for cocaine, it may press the lever occasionally, but not as frequently as its counterpart in the dull environment. These findings were a big deal in the behaviorism world because they put a lot of previous results into context and help explain the link between poverty and drug use. This sounds like it's probably a really fascinating experiment for anyone who's never actually lived with an addiction before. Plenty of privileged people experience it. I'm half convinced the reason we don't see as much of a link between the rich and their habits is because more of them get away without as many consequences. And I'm not knocking the rich, for the record, but my point is that rats and humans are not the same. Rats run on instinct. Humans run on more than that. When a person becomes addicted, they start behaving in ways that leave their instincts essentially shattered. Rich or poor, everyone has space to explore. There are free things to do and wonderful people to meet nearly anywhere if you're willing to look for them. Recovery does involve some amount of filling the void, but it takes more than that alone. If this study was truly instructional, addiction would be solved. You'll notice that it is not. But hey, at least you found a fun way to endanger some rats. Story 9. Research on cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort experienced when holding 2 or more contradictory beliefs. Adjusting our beliefs is just one way of dealing with the mental discomfort. Basically, the idea is that when we have 2 contradictory beliefs, we unconsciously adjust one to make it compatible with the other. For example, in one experiment, participants that were paid less to do a boring task found the task to be more interesting than those that were paid more. We unconsciously reason like this. If I didn't do it for the money, then I must have done it because it's interesting. Our minds work like this pretty often. Story 10. Aaron and Dutton, 1974, misattribution of arousal. Men who had just walked across a bridge, either steady or unsteady, were approached by a female psychology student posing to do a project on the effects of exposure to scenic attractions on creative expression. The men had to complete a questionnaire and write a short dramatic story about a picture she provided, and she gave them her phone number if they had more questions. Men who walked across the shaky bridge were more likely to call her up because they misattributed the arousal from the bridge to the woman. Too long didn't read? Watch a horror movie on the first date. Wait, hold up. Is this implying that the men were aroused simply by walking over a shaky bridge? I know there are a lot of jokes about how we're so easily turned on that even a cool breeze will do the trick. And sure, I guess that's true for some people. But walking across a bridge? Also, how can it be proven that the men were calling her in search of a date when she specified to call her if they had questions? Maybe the guys who walked across the shaky bridge simply didn't enjoy the experiment as much and didn't want to follow up with it. I'm not saying the experiment's conclusions were necessarily wrong, it just feels like there are too many immeasurable variables to really make any conclusive findings. But I also haven't read the full study, so maybe there are details missing. If you know, feel free to elaborate in the comments. Story 11. Mice were put on two sides of a wall with a door in it. Only the right mouse could open the door. Slowly, they filled the left mouse's room with water, and eventually, when the right mouse saw them in danger, they opened the door. However, mice that had previously been on the left side and were now on the right side, mice who had previously been wetted, opened the door considerably faster, because they knew how unpleasant it was to be in the other scenario. Basically, mice have empathy. Since it isn't mentioned in the thread for some reason, this is as good a time as any to mention the 1961 Milgram experiment, which tested the theory that Nazis were indeed just following orders. Participants were told to quiz someone in another room and shock them if they answered wrong. They weren't actually shocking anyone, but they could hear an actor screaming as the shock supposedly got worse. But because they were told to do it, they did it. Very few refused to continue shocking the test taker in spite of his screams. But one man refused because he was an electrician and knew firsthand what being shocked was like. So yes, whether rodent or human, empathy is indeed a powerful motivator. Story 12. It's not that psychopaths lack empathy, but rather they have manual settings. A specific region of the brain lights up when people experience empathy. For most people, it's an automatic, subconscious response. But in a study where they showed emotional videos to psychopaths and non-psychos while scanning their brains, psychopaths would only light that region of the brain when specifically asked to feel for the character, while the controlled participants would light up automatically. Story 13. If you stare into a dimly lit, e.g. candlelit, mirror for 10 plus minutes, you start to see hallucinations. What individuals see tends to vary, but they've used this as a test to simulate schizophrenia before because some see monsters, deformities, general weird stuff. I did a variation of it for a mate in uni and completely wimped out of it. After my face started not looking like my face anymore, I had a complete dissociation. I stopped looking and just waited out the time. Story 14. Hedonic adaptation. Put simply, a person who had just won the lottery and another person who had just been paralyzed took a survey to measure their life contentment. Obviously, it was high and low, respectively. However, they both took the same survey a year later and both scored similarly. The point being that, regardless of what happens to you in life, good or bad, you will always adapt and spend most of your life feeling neutral. I'm pretty sure Buddhists have been trying to teach people this for centuries. They simply have other, more memorable names for it. The two most relevant are probably impermanence and dissatisfaction, which are intrinsically related. It's not that life can never satisfy you, but nothing satisfactory that it does give you can ever last forever. That sounds depressing, but it means the same is true of negative emotions as well. Obviously, paralysis itself is typically fairly permanent, but hedonic adaptation is a good explanation for why its mental and emotional effects don't have to be. Story 15. If people have the upper hand, they will put others down to keep it. An experiment told a class of kids that having blue eyes meant you were smarter, achieved more, etc. All of a sudden, kids with blue eyes formed their own groups. Things like bullying and exclusion of other eye colors started too. They repeated the experiment with different eye colors in different classes, all with the same results. Story 16. Reconsolidation. When you retrieve memory from your long-term memory, it's susceptible to being manipulated. This can lead to memories being totally changed from the source. This is why eyewitness accounts cannot be fully seen as true. This knowledge is also being used to help people with PTSD by changing the negative memories they have of their particular trauma. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in a book called Blink. A study had people write down their accounts of where they were when they heard about a recent tragedy. A year later, they were asked to retell that same story, except many people's stories had changed entirely. For instance, one guy thought he was in a lab with a colleague who had never worked in the lab on that particular weekday. What's also interesting is that people tend to prefer the false memories, since those are the ones they've built up over time. When shown their handwritten accounts from the year before, most participants in the study argued that it must have been the original, more recent memories that they had gotten wrong, and the new ones were in fact the truth. Makes you question nearly everything you remember about your entire life. Story 17. White rats and black rats were raised separately without seeing each other. When a black rat was placed in the white rat's cage, the other rats ostracized him. When white and black rats are raised together and a new black rat is placed in a cage, the white rats accept him. So basically, rats are racist unless raised to accept differences. Story 18. There was an experiment to measure the dopamine, i.e. happiness, hit your brain takes when eating something you're craving. The dopamine builds with the anticipation and peaks right as you take the first bite. Then, after the first moment it's in your mouth, the dopamine levels begin to decrease. Story 19. The car crash experiment. It demonstrated that the way investigators word a question has an immediate effect on the subject's memory of an event. It was part of a suite of studies by Elizabeth Loftus with various other co-researchers that began to call him to question the veracity of eyewitness accounts. To add some context, participants were asked questions about car accidents in which one word was changed. Some were asked about the speed of the vehicles at the time they hit each other. For others, the word hit might be changed to smashed or bumped. The word used affected participants' speed estimates. Also, when the word smashed was used, participants asked if they saw any broken glass in the footage were more likely to say yes, even though no glass appeared in the film. Story 20. I don't know the name of it, but apparently two people become closer if they survive through something together. Not even actual surviving death scenarios, but anything that has you on your toes and heart racing, like a roller coaster. I'm pretty sure this OP is describing what's known as a trauma bond, and it can actually be dangerous in certain instances because it leads people to mistake shared trauma for a relationship compatibility. They're not the same thing. My college self could have used that advice on countless occasions. Story 21. The Rosenthal Effect. The prejudice and expectations you have towards a student/contestant/etc. highly dictates his performance in the long run. Look it up, aka Pygmalion effect. Okay, so apparently the Pygmalion effect often is referred to as self-fulfilling prophecy. So I'm willing to admit that my critique on that first experiment may have been wrong. Maybe I was overemphasizing the word self, but I still stand by my belief that the drunk driving experiment is better. Don't argue this in the comments. If there's one thing we've learned today, it's that if you tell me my ideas are brilliant, they will be. Story 22. Not a psychologist, but the one where, given a choice between sitting down and doing nothing or shocking oneself, people tend to choose the shock. Ergo, we would choose pain over boredom. To be entirely honest, when you browse insane Reddit stories for a living, the difference between shock and boredom is lost on you pretty quickly. But this does explain people who seem to push the self-destruct button every time their life has been going well for a while. Yet another bit of advice my college self really could have used. But what about you? Did any of these experiments give you a peek into the workings of your own mind? Feel free to do some navel-gazing in the comments below. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.